What is going on, guys? DragonTamerBlayde here, back from our Elder Scrolls Legends, and today FrostSpark has been released. And I have played exactly 0 games with the FrostSpark card so far, but I wanted to do this video before I played any games so that my first impressions wouldn't be swayed at all by playing with the cards. But what I wanted to do today was take a minute, and well, more than a few minutes actually, and we're going to go through all 11 cards. I'm going to rank them in relative power level from number 11 to number 1, and maybe we'll come take a look back on this video in a couple months and we'll see how right or wrong I wind up being. Power level is obviously relative. I'm going to give special consideration to cards that are good in multiple archetypes or multiple decks versus like if a card is really good in just one specific deck. Not that it'll lose points, but it'll get bumped down a tad for that purpose. Ubiquitous power is worth more points to me than niche power, but at the same time, power is still power. But without further ado, let's get on into it and get on to the number 11 card. Alright, number 11 on my list is going to be Harmony. Harmony I just feel like is way too situational of a card to be powerful very often. And the combos that you would need to build around to make this card viable, I think make your deck as a whole worse. You're going to see people, and you're occasionally going to lose to this card, or this card is going to delay you by a turn or two, and it'll probably incorrectly tempt you to thinking this card is better than it is. Not that I think this card is horrible. This card could be okay in Arena. In Constructed, I think it'll be mostly meh, unless we have more cards that care about the power level of your opponent's creatures besides Execute, Grizzly Gourmet, Grand Inquisitor, Arrowstorm, stuff like that. We have a handful, but unless we have more of those cards and they wind up better, I don't think Harmony ever really rises to the top to be included in many lists, besides maybe decks that try to meme with it. But yeah, that's why Harmony is number 11. Alright, number 10 on my list is going to be Apex Wolf, and it kind of pains me to put this card here because I honestly do like this card a lot, and I think this card is going to really shine in Arena, although the epic rarity will probably push it down a peg or two in Arena just because of how rarely you'll see it. But I do think Apex Wolf is going to enable some really cool combos. It's just not quite consistent enough. I think it can do some cool things, and I think you'll see maybe a deck or two play it, and at first it'll probably just be for the newness factor, and we'll see if it winds up being good enough over a period of time to stay in those decks. I don't know. Like, I like Apex Wolf. I just feel like if the stats were just a little bit better, it would be really good. But also Drain is a dangerous keyword to put on cards. So I feel like Apex Wolf could wind up surprising me over time, and I'm definitely looking forward to playing it in a lot of, or mostly rage-focused decks. I just think it's a little bit too focused in where it's going to see play in Constructed, and it might not even make the cut in those lists at the end of the day, and for those reasons I had to put Apex Wolf at number 10. Alright, number 9 on my list is going to be Deathhound, and I was flip-flopping back and forth between this card and the number 8 card for where I wanted to slot these guys. Actually, 9, 8, and 7, I had a hard time really quite slotting in here. But I just figured Deathhound, it has a lot of competition. A lot of the decks are going to be running it. A lot of the mid-range decks that I thought that Deathhound could potentially fit into have better options in the 4, 5, 6 slot to really run Deathhound a lot of the time, and it's not quite as good against aggro as you would want it to be to consider including it in some of those mid-range lists. I think Mid-Sorcerer is the only card that's really going to consider this card. And even then, you got your Shadowfen Priests, you've got Whiterun Protectors, and I'm sure you'll have more and more cards coming out that are going to compete in this slot, and maybe you don't even run a 5-drop there at all, and you stock up on some 4s and 6s or something like that. So I don't think Deathhound is bad. Kind of like Apex Wolf, I think it's going to struggle to find somewhere where it's going to fit in. And the unfortunate thing is, my biggest thing that I want to do with this thing is obviously meme with it with Imperial Armor and stuff like that. I just don't think... I think the lack of charge could potentially prevent this thing from really fulfilling the meme dream. And then the tougher thing on top of that is the fact that it has guard. It helps it as an overall card, But for the meme point of view, it kind of makes it worse because you can't hide this thing in the shadow lane and then throw a bunch of items on top of it. It has guards so your opponent can kill this thing right away. So I think it's even going to be difficult to pull off in the meme department. And in Arena, again, it's an epic. You're not going to see it as often. You may consider running it in Arena just as a beefy 5-drop, but I think the epic rarity is going to kind of push it out of... I don't want to say push it out of favor, but you're not going to see it as often as you would expect or maybe want to see it in Arena. So for those reasons, I had to put Death Hound at number 9, but like I said, it easily could have been number 8 or number 7, but without context, that means nothing, so let's get on into the number 8 card. Alright, the number 8 card on my list is going to be Destruction Tutor. Destruction Tutor obviously has tons of synergy in damage-focused action decks. The only problem is those things don't really exist at the moment. And while reducing your Lightning Bolt and your Ice Storms is obviously a really good thing to do, is that worth running a 5-cost 3/5 in your deck is the question. So to really get quality, value, and use out of running this card in your deck, and obviously those stats for a 5-drop aren't very great, so to get used out of that, you really have to start building your deck around this card and including maybe some more damage-dealing actions that you wouldn't have otherwise included. And again, those decks don't exist yet, so we're going to have to see where they can live. Maybe some sort of burst assassin thing. I know there's been kind of groundwork of that deck laid, and maybe it gets tweaked a little bit and runs Destruction Tutor with Hexmage. But then to really get the max value out of this card, you need to drop this, a Hexmage, that's 10 Magicka right there and 2 cards, and then have a bunch of actions to play on top of it, and hope that neither one dies to a Prophecy. All of that is very idealistic scenario. It's kind of living the pipe dream there. So I don't think it's going to happen as often, but I still think Destruction Tutor synergizes with enough popular cards to where this card can see some use in the right decks. It turns Ice Spike into a free cycle, which almost is worth considering running the 2 of those cards alone if you're the type of deck that runs Firebolt and Lightning Bolt anyway, because then getting that kind of Magicka reduction, even if you just reduce 2 actions, I think Destruction Tutor kind of pays for itself. But then you need to do at least 2 actions, I think, to really warrant this, because then if you're only going to reduce 1 by 2, then it's kind of like, why didn't you just play Mage's Guild Recruit? So that's why I think Destruction Tutor could potentially get knocked down a peg, but I still think the effect is powerful enough that there's going to be at least 1 or 2 decks that find a way to run this card at the end of the day. Like I said, I could have easily swapped this card with Death Hound to be number 9, but this card also could have been number 7. But we'll talk about number 7 coming up here right in a second. Number 7 on my list is going to be Karthspire Scout, and I think this is one that's going to kind of surprise some of you guys. You guys are probably going to be like, what? That card's terrible. Why is this card even on your list? This should be at number 13. I honestly think this card is going to see some play. I think it is okay in Orc decks. Like I said, you don't really picture this as... you don't play this as like an aggressive 1-drop, although you can use it as such. You're going to use it as draw, as well as I think you're going to really want to use it for cheap activators. So this plus Stone Shard Orc is a 4 Magicka, 2 bodies, deal 2 damage. Or you can use it with Wood Orc Headhunter as a 6 Magicka. Make sure you can use your Orc from hand. Does that wind up being good enough at the end of the day? I don't know. But Orcs do struggle to draw cards, so maybe having that cheap activator that also draws you a card could be good enough to push this card into contention. I also think certain slower decks might consider running Karthspire Scout if they need extra draw. Most control decks usually have tons of Magicka to spare because they're not really playing a ton, so increasing the cost of something by 1 isn't the worst thing. And to top it all off, I think this card is going to be really, really, really good in Abomination Scout. You're playing cards that cost 0 or 1 Magicka anyway, so increasing them by 1 Magicka normally would seem like a bad thing, but that deck also plays 1 to 2 Thieves Guild Fences on the board when it starts going off, which means the 1 cost Magicka increase that Karthspire Scout is going to give doesn't really harm what you're trying to do at the end of the day. So I think this card is going to surprise some people and see more play than you were expecting when you first revealed the card. But we'll ultimately see if it ends up being played anywhere other than Abomination Scout. But that still made it good enough for number 7 on my list. Number 6 on my list is going to be Green Pact Ambusher. It's a card that I think... it's one of those cards I think is going to be really good in certain decks, but not see play in a lot of decks. Something like Prophecy Battle Mage I think can slot this in almost instantly if they want to go super all-in on the Prophecy count. Although with a deck that aggressive, you're probably still going to want to continue to play... Greystone Ravager If not instead, then alongside this, because Gravestone Ravager at least can hide in the shadow lane. But Green Pact Ambusher does have Prophecy and Guard, as well as the decent effect. Something like a slower warrior deck that shuffles these guys in with Galen could be really solid, as well as these cards after Journey to Sovngarde could be really solid as well. The only problem is I don't think any of those decks that would be able to pull that off with Green Pact Ambusher exist at the moment, nor do I think they're really particularly set up to do super well. So I think a very aggressive deck that just wants as much stats on the board as early as possible, a la some kind of glass cannon type of deck, could consider running this card, as well as just getting the free effect occasionally against a token deck or a fellow aggressive deck. I don't think that's why you play this card. I think it's just an added benefit. So like I said, I think this card is going to be really good in a couple different aggressive decks. Maybe if certain slower defensive guard decks ever exist, this card could see some play. And I think it's going to be mostly a non-factor in Arena due to its rarity. But it's a solid card, and I think it's going to make a couple decks really, really good. But I think this is one of the cards that I could be the most wrong about. But we'll see. Who knows? But I still think for now it's good enough to be number 6 on the list. Number 5 on my list is the legendary from the FrostSpark expansion. It is Wilds Incarnate, 7 cost 5/6 with Guard, with the ability draw a card if you have 4 runes and draw a second card if you have 5 runes. I think this card is being massively underrated by a lot of people. I think a lot of people are just kind of writing this card off as being horrible, just because they think that every single game you never have 4 or 5 runes by turn 7. But the thing to remember with that is, yeah, if you're playing against an aggressive deck, 9 times out of 10, probably more often than that, you're not going to be able to trigger this card's effect because your aggressive opponent will have beaten down at least 1 or 2 of your runes by the time you play this card. But let's say you're playing this in like a mid-range type deck, you're playing against control. Since you're the mid-range deck, you're going to be beating your opponent's face in. They're going to be spending most of their resources removing threats from your board and not going face. This card is almost guaranteed to trigger in a mid-range deck playing against control. And not just guaranteed to trigger, it has a probably greater than 50%, if not more, chance of drawing the 2 cards against control in a mid-range deck. The question is, what mid-range decks have room for this card? And I think that's a solid, different question. But even if you like topped out your curve with this card, I think this card is better than Jarl. I think this card is... I think it's better than a lot of the late game draw. You're not going to want to run this in like a Crusader deck because they already have way better other draw available. But let's say a Spell Sword mid-range deck, maybe even like a mid-range Assassin deck if you don't want to run some of the action-based draw cards. Even something like a mid-monk, mid-mage can consider running this card if they go a little bit more defensive heavy and less pure aggressive that a lot of our mid-range decks have become. If you ever have a slightly slow mid-range deck, I think this card is going to really shine. Like I said, I really just think that people are underrating how often you can have 4 or 5 runes left against a control opponent. In a mid-range versus mid-range battle, it's going to obviously come down to who got on the board first, who really took control of the game. And, you know, in that situation, it's probably like a 50-50 chance. And then against your aggro opponents, it's going to be tougher to trigger this card. So I think this card is going to shine in slower metas. It can help you find those 1 or 2 cards you need to try and finish off your opponent. The only problem is the meta has a lot of slow decks, but also a lot of super fast decks. So I don't think this card is great in the current meta, but I think it could be really, really great if things slow down soon, which I anticipate they will as more and more cards are announced. I'm mostly banking on Wilds Incarnate's potential for putting it number 5 on my list. Number 4 on my list is going to be Piercing Twilight, the very first card that was revealed from the FrostSpark expansion. We got the 4/4/4 guard card that has the effect, choose a card in your opponent's discard, banish all cards from the discard and from their deck with the same name as the chosen card. So if this card didn't have guard, I would like it a lot less. I've already talked about this card pretty extensively in the first video about it. But I think a 4/4/4 with guard is a good enough body to be played in a variety of matchups. So it's not the worst card in the world if you're slower than or if you're faster than your slow opponent. You can still drop this down, and 4/4/4 is enough to kind of just beat some damage down. And the guard also helps you survive against other aggressive opponents. But my favorite thing about this card is the disruption. Every single deck, besides a singleton deck, has multiple copies of cards that they think are really good, and thus they think will help them win the game. Removing any of those cards, for the most part, is going to do nothing but help your odds of winning said game. So, you're not going to play Piercing Twilight and target like your opponent's Marked Man or something like that, because that just wouldn't give you the quality that you're looking for. But if you're playing against a token deck, you can target their 5th Legion Trainers, or their Pit Lions, or their Divine Fervors, and that's going to greatly reduce their chances of winning. Token Crusader, you target their Crusader's Assault, or their Housecarl, and that's just disruption. That disruption can be huge. If you target your opponent's Lightning Bolt, you can remove the chance of prophecies being hit or certain creatures being removed. Just, there's so much quality in disrupting your opponent's deck. People don't put bad... I don't want to say that because I'm one of those people. Most opponents do not put bad cards in their deck on purpose. So removing any of them is a really good thing for you, as long as you don't mess around and remove their lowest quality card in their deck to make their deck more consistent. So most of the time, Piercing Twilight is going to be an amazing disruption play, and I think I can see a world where we're all really sick of Piercing Twilight in a couple of months here. She probably could even be considered a little bit higher on the list, but for now, she is number 4. Number 3 on my list is the card that I revealed, the Torval Extortionist, and I really thought about putting this card at number 2, but it just didn't quite make sense at the moment, just the way the world is working. But this card is a absolutely fantastic mid-range, or even to an extent topping off your aggressive curve, although not having charge kind of sucks. I don't think you really need it in an aggressive deck, but I think this card is amazing in mid-range decks. It's going to enable a lot of amazing combos that I've already talked about in the breakdown video of this card. But I think this kind of stat line is the kind of stat line that a lot of green-based mid-range decks have needed to get themselves back into the meta, since a lot of mid-range has kind of fallen off. This kind of just stats on a stick is incredibly quality, and the ability on top of it just makes this card even more awesome. As I'm talking about it, I kind of want to put it at number 2, but you'll see why in a minute, why we have number 2 and 1, how they are. But I think this card is going to be really good. This card has an incredibly high ceiling, but a caveat: if the meta stays as aggro and conscription focused as it currently is, Torval Extortionist might not see much play outside of rage decks, so it remains to be seen how the meta is shaken up. But I do think this card can do some pretty amazing things, and that made it good enough for number 3 on my list. Number 2 on my list is going to be Shadow Marking. I think this is the kind of card that can be thrown into almost any deck that exists, and it is one of the... it might even be the most efficient card at drawing and digging through your deck in the game. Things like Merchant's Camel do something similar, but this card lets you keep 2 cards instead of discarding. So unless you're the kind of deck that wants cards in the discard, Shadow Marking might be the best card in the game for digging through your deck. The way this card is going to work is you're going to play it, you're going to keep the 2 best cards and give your opponent whatever the 3rd card is that is the worst out of the 3. Occasionally, it'll be a 3 really, really good cards, and you'll give your opponent really, really good cards, but at the end of the day, you still drew 2 cards for 3 and thinned your deck by 3. This card is going to be amazing in all combo decks. I think most, if not all, aggro decks could consider running this card to dig through their decks super, super quickly. The only deck that maybe doesn't run this card is Crusader. All other aggro decks, I think, if they have green, could consider running this card. I mean, as far as digging through your deck, I think Crusader wouldn't need a card like this. All other aggro decks could definitely consider running this card. Combo decks are going to love this card. Control decks might not really care about it, but at the same time, this definitely could help mitigate having a really crappy draw as a control deck and help you get into your answers faster so you don't lose the game. I think we're potentially going to see this card all over the place. This card is just really, really, really good. This is another card that maybe could have been number 1 on the list, but number 1 I'm kind of in love with at the moment, just out of all the ways I've thought about it. So let's go ahead and talk about number 1. So number 1 on my list at the moment for the revealed or the released FrostSpark cards is Sword of the Inferno. I absolutely love this card. I massively underrated this card in my first hour thinking about this card. It combos with everything: Drain, Lethal, Slay, self-damage, So many decks are going to like running this card. I think this is a great aggro card as long as you have the health to survive. It's a great mid-range card. It's going to help out a lot of my Slay combo decks. It could be decent in a rage deck as like a kamikaze type of thing. I think this card is amazing. It's rare, so I think it's going to be one of the best arena cards up there with Torval Extortionist. I think this card is going to do a lot of work in the coming months. Be ready to see this card a lot. It's an early game answer to Skulk while also triggering your Slays and triggering your Drains. There's so many crazy things that can happen with this card, and I just can't wait to get using it in tons of different decks. So at the moment, I think it's the best card, and we'll see when we reflect on this in a couple months if it winds up holding true. So what's your guys' top 11? Let me know down below in the comment section. I'd love to see how our opinions differ and which one of us winds up being the most correct in the coming months. But yeah, that's going to be it for now, guys. As always, thank you all very, very much for watching. I'm DragonTamerBlayde, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace.